Hello everyone. Good evening and welcome to the evening session of the Hindu Lit Fest. So we are having a very interesting guest with us today, Anjan Sundaram, who is an award-winning war correspondent. And Anjan has written 3 books. So his latest book is Breakup, A Marriage in Wartime. So I was just talking to him before we started this session that his first book, Stringer, A Reporter's Journey in the Congo, which was out almost a decade ago. So this is my personal copy. I had bought this book back then. It's a very interesting book. And after finishing this book, Anjan, I was actually going through your profile. You studied mathematics in Yale University. And you are also telling me that you had a stint with IIT Madras. So it's fascinating to know, I mean, for me as well as the audience, that how did a mathematics student in Yale University end up being a war correspondent in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? So if you can tell us a little bit about the journey.
Sure, thank you, Stanley. And thanks everyone for coming. It's nice to be back in Chennai. As Stanley mentioned, I went to school here for 2 years at Vidyamandir, Mylapore. I was at IIT Chennai for 1 year, studying engineering. Before I went to Yale, started studying mathematics. And I guess the moment that I realized that I wanted to become a journalist or wanted to travel was I was in the lunch hall at Yale, and I opened the New York Times. And in the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, there was a little article about Congo, and that it said 4 million people had died back then, and now it's 6 million. And I thought to myself, why is this small article in the middle of the newspaper, why isn't this on the front page? How can an article about events so large be so small? Or how can it be such a short article? And so one thing led to the next, and I was paying my final bill at Yale, and the cashier, she was African. So I asked her, where are you from? She said, I'm from Zaire, which is the old name for Congo. And I said, oh, I might go to Zaire. I might go to Congo. And she said, you stupid Yale kids, you don't even know how to sign a check. I could steal all your money and you wouldn't even know it. And what are you going to do going to Congo? You're going to get killed or robbed. And no, you can't go. I'm not going to help you. And so she had an evening job at a parking lot. And I would go every evening and buy her milkshakes and hang out with her. And then finally she said, I could stay with her family. And that's how I bought a one-way ticket to Congo, and I showed up at this family's house. I got a room, and that's where I began to learn journalism.
Interesting. See, basically his 3 books, the first book is about the Congo, as he was talking about, and the second book is about Rwanda. I think he spent some 5 years in Rwanda. Bad news, the last journalist in a dictatorship. And the third book is about the Central African Republic. So Anjan writes in the early pages of this book that Central African Republic is not a very well-known country. If you tell somebody about Central African Republic, they will ask you back, which republic in Central Africa?
I pitched stories to editors, and I said I want to pitch stories about the Central African Republic, and they asked me, which Central African Republic?
Fascinating. And there is a very wonderful passage where he describes, the moment he landed in Bangui, the Central African Republic. And also, in 2014, you went to 2014. So it was immediately after the rebels took over power and a civil war was going on. And Anjan goes to Central African Republic when violence was raging to report what was happening in the country. And in all your 3 books, you tell us stories about Africa. And Africa is a very interesting continent, but at the same time, I think it is the least reported continent, maybe. A lot of things are happening in Africa. There are, of course, conflicts, and there are also successful economic stories. There are geopolitical competition because China is there. China, Russia, and the United States are trying to maximize their influence in Africa. And Paul Kagame, apparently, one of the characters in your book, Kagame is being hailed by many media outlets as an economic reformer, as a liberator of Rwanda. So I mean, my question is that why Africa? Why did you choose Africa? And also, what Africa you saw?
So I guess, you know, the first thing that was interesting to me was exactly as you said. I read an article, an interview of this Polish journalist called Kapuczynski. And he said he was in Africa in the 60s and 70s and there were huge events happening in Africa. Coup d'etats, revolutions. He said it was human history unfolding before my eyes. And then he asked, but where were the writers, where were the poets, where were the philosophers? All these people who say they write about the human condition, they weren't there. It was just him and a couple of journalists. Yeah. And he felt this was wrong. And so when I read that, I was 21 at university in the US, and I thought to myself, if huge events are happening on this continent, and there aren't enough people observing, witnessing, writing about it, then I want to do that. It seemed like there was a big opportunity, and I called up foreign reporters and I asked them, is it still the case? And they said, absolutely. And they said Congo is a particular case of that phenomenon. Yeah. There's a lot of news, a lot of huge events, and Congo, just for context, is the size of Western Europe. It's all of France, Spain, Germany, Portugal, the UK, all put together. It's that big, even though it doesn't look so big on the map. That's how huge it is. So you have all these, and when I showed up, I was 22 years old. I hadn't written a journalistic article in my life, and I was the 4th international foreign reporter who showed up and was covering this enormous country. So to me, it felt kind of overwhelmingly huge. And it also felt, you know, I was studying mathematics before then, and in mathematics, I had begun my PhD, or, you know, process. And in mathematics, when you start your PhD, they always give you a small question. Yeah. They give you a small question on the edge of mathematics, and they say, you need to go after this. And then you can earn the permission to come at the central questions in mathematics. And here I felt in Congo, I could go to one of the biggest war in the world even now, and the biggest war since World War II, and no one was stopping me. So it felt like an adventure, it felt like an opportunity, it felt like a chance to see for myself and witness for myself some of the big questions in the world. Why are there so many refugees? Why is this huge war there?
Yeah. And also, you know, you take a lot of risks in your line of work, because I was reading Breakup. There is a chilling passage in the book where Anjan and his teammates were stuck in a rebel-held territory in Central African Republic, surrounded by rebels who were holding guns, pointing at them. And there was a commander who was very aggressive. And then it is a very tense situation. You know, one of your colleagues, Yusuf, if I am not mistaken, he was offering his prayers, and then he is telling you, holding on to your finger, that he is ready to die. Yeah. So it's a very chilling passage. You won't jump even a word if you read that part of this book. I mean, you have described in the book what happened, you know. But my question is that, what was going on in your head when you were there, standing in the middle of, you know, hundreds of rebel commanders holding the impoverished, who are living in impoverished conditions? They apparently stole your jeep. So what was going on in your head?
So I guess at that point I really thought I was going to die. I really looked around myself. I looked at the trees, I looked at the sky, and I remember thinking to myself, oh, I'm going to die in a beautiful place. That was a thought that ran through my head. And then after I had accepted that this might happen for a moment, and then I thought, no, I don't want to die. You know? Yeah. So
you talked to the commander. You actually asked him to order your soldiers to put down the guns, right?
And they didn't. No, they didn't obey him. So that was even more scary. When he, you know, and so, like you said, Yusuf, my driver, was a Muslim driver, and the rebels were Christian, and there was a religious war. So somebody recognized Yusuf sitting in the car, and recognized that he was Muslim, and then they began to heckle him and threaten him. And at that point, I called him to sit next to me, and he came and sat next to me, and he went on his knees and began to say his prayers. And then he looked up at me and said, if they want to take me, I'm ready. You know, I'm ready to go. and he held my little finger. I looked at us like, no one's going anywhere. We're all going to be fine. And a moment later, I stood up and I said to the commander, if anything happens to me or anybody here with me, it's going to be really bad for you. And I just bluffed him. You know, it was a complete, I had no protection, no power. He could have killed me, nothing would have happened. And but he believed me. He looked me in the eye and he believed me. And he told all his fighters to put their guns down, but they didn't put their guns down. And so that got really scary. And so then he said, okay, you can leave, but you leave Yusuf with us. And at that point, my colleague said, no, we're all going or we're all staying. And then the commander said, well, we're taking everything in your car. And so we said, sure, take all our stuff. So they took our mattresses, mosquito nets, our medicines. They're really poor fighters. So they took our medicines, food, everything that we had, and we said, take it, and then we, got into the car and drove off. But yes, at that moment, it was one of the few moments, or one of the, certain moments in this work where I thought it's going to be over now.
Yeah, there is another account where you are stuck in a church and there is an impending massacre going to happen, and you are trying to get help, and then the answer you get from the diplomatic missions is that people kill each other all the time in this part of the world, and then suddenly one of your teammates is an American, and then you let New York, Washington know that one of your teammates is an American, then everything starts moving, and then you have UN peacekeepers. And one particular line you have written struck me, that the lives of thousands of Central American people is worth less than one American life.
Yes, so thousands of Central Africans, right? So there were
Central Africa,
3,000 Central Africans in the courtyard of a church, and we showed up, and this government fighter showed up at the same time and threatened the nun. There was an Italian nun running the church, and the government soldier accused her of giving shelter to militiamen and said everybody needs to get out of here by 8 a.m. tomorrow or we're going to kill everybody. And so my colleagues and I, we called a bunch of embassies, diplomats, the UN, the Italian nun, she called the Pope. Nobody could do anything. Yeah. Everybody said, this is Africa, this is what happens in the war, we can't do anything. And so we stayed. And in the middle of the night, my American colleague called his office in New York. He worked for Human Rights Watch. So he called Human Rights Watch in New York City. And he said, hey, well, we're going to be attacked at 8 a.m. I just want to let you know. And so his office called the White House. The White House called the faction of the government fighters that were in our town and told them, if anything happens to our guy, you're toast. And so the government, the next morning at 8 a.m. there were some shots, but there was no killing, there was no shooting. And then the US government got these peacekeepers to come to that church to protect everybody. All of this didn't happen anywhere else in the war. It just happened because there was one American life at risk. So it kind of shows how, how different lives are valued. And that's also true in our reporting work. Yeah. If one American dies, then we report on it. If thousands of Central Africans die, nobody cares.
No, so if they wanted to stop the killing, they could have done it.
Yeah, that's what was shocking. And the Italian nun, a few months before, there had been a massacre of 150 people or something like that. And she'd called the Pope, and the Pope said, I can't do anything, and those 150 people were massacred. And she had somehow come to believe that there's nothing you could do. But then after we showed up, and my American colleague saved 3,000 people, she realized, no, actually, if the world wants, we can protect all these people. It's just that nobody wants to do it.
Yeah. And one more thing that struck me in the book was that you say that journalists are neutral. I think the context was that you were asked to spy for the government when you went to the rebel territory. And then you're saying that, no, we can't do that because we are journalists, we are neutral. You have seen terrible things, if I read this book, because you have seen and reported mass graves in Gaza, and you had survivors coming and telling you that they were being butchered like animals. And then you were talking to this commander who says that he wanted to either exterminate or push out all the Muslims out of the Central African Republic, because he says that if there are no Muslims, there won't be any support for the regime. So my question, it's a general, not specifically to this particular incident, but my question is that when you see things like this, is it possible for journalists, for a reporter to stay neutral?
I guess neutrality means that you give all sides a voice, right? And you listen to all sides. But the reason I'm interested in these kinds of situations is because in the darkest places, I find really inspiring, powerful, and heroic figures. So one example is in this war, I traveled to the west of the Central African Republic, and there was a cathedral, and there was a Polish priest, and the Polish priest was an abbot, and I was having lunch with him, and he told me a church and a town 100 kilometers north had been attacked, and the soldiers had stolen the door of the church for the wood, and now the priest was sleeping in the open, and the altar was now exposed. So this abbot, this Polish abbot said, I'm going to drive across rebel territory 100 kilometers to replace the door. And I built the door here with my carpenter. So my carpenter and I are going to go and replace the door. So I asked him, can I come with you? And he said, okay. So we drove across this 100 kilometers, and for me this was just crazy. This guy was risking his life to replace a door, but to show the government that that priest in that town was supported. He was not alone. And that was his real purpose. It was a show of solidarity. And so when we were driving across that rebel zone, this priest, this abbot, would stop in every village and honk, and the village would be empty, because as soon as they heard our car coming, they thought it was the government come to kill them, so they just ran into the forest and they would hide. And so we would drive into these empty villages, and the abbot would honk, and somebody would recognize his car and then run out of the forest, really fast, and shove a piece of paper through the window, and it landed on my lap, and on that page was a list written by hand of all the people who were sick, who needed medicines, all the people who had been killed, all the people whose property had been stolen, all the help that was needed, all the hungry people, what food was missing. And so this abbot would collect these pages from each village and take it back to the town, and then tell the NGOs, this is the food, the medicine, and so on that's needed. And in this age, 21st century, where we have Twitter, we think that we're over-informed, there's too much information. This is how information is collected in a war zone, by hand, by one brave person. And for me, this guy was completely heroic, and I told him, you're a war correspondent, you're a foreign reporter, and he said, I don't have my byline in any newspapers. And I said to him, but you're doing the work. And very humble, and he didn't, want attention. Nobody knew he was doing this work, but he was compelled to risk his life to do essential work in the war.
Yeah. And one of the interesting aspects of the book is that this is not only about Central African Republic. So there is this intertwined narrative of his own personal memoir on the one side, and his frontline correspondence on the other side. And once he's back from his reporting, Anjan has written in the book that his wife is telling him that a man has responsibilities. And the title of the book itself is, you can see Breakup. So while I was reading the book, I knew something was coming. I was reading about Central African Republic, and then, occasionally after reporting from the front lines, after interviewing the commanders, the rebels, Anjan would go back to his shelter, and then he would start thinking about his wife and, his child. He has a young family. So there is a very interesting, very engaging personal narrative also, which is also part of this book, which makes it, all the more powerful. So, and then he says that I mean, towards the end of the book, he describes how he fell apart. You know, you and your wife moved apart. So my question is that now, it's been 10 years, I think. Your daughter was born when you went to Bangui. She's now 10 years old, he was telling me. Now when you turn back, do you regret your reporting journey to Central African Republic because of all the risks involved, because of the personal costs you had to pay?
I guess the short answer is no, because I've chosen to continue this work. I think I convey that to her and pass that on. But you know, what you say is interesting because I do write all the books in as memoirs in the first person. And part of the reason I do that is to convey, because I feel that the places I'm writing about are somewhat remote. They can seem far away, they can seem distant, they can seem removed from our daily lives. And one of the reasons I write about myself is to serve as a kind of bridge. And so often you'll find books by foreign correspondents begin with a sense of authority. And I like to start my books in a place of ignorance. I like to start my books at the moment when I knew almost nothing about the country. And I say to the reader, I know almost nothing about this place, but this is why I'm interested. And if you are interested in the same way, you can sit on my shoulder and we can travel together and learn together. And so that's the kind of journey that I describe in the books. I also present myself as subjective, whereas a lot of foreign correspondent books come from a place of authority, you know, or objectivity. They try to portray some kind of objective truth. Whereas I like to say, you know, where I'm coming from, who I am. I'm, you know, from India. I grew up in India. I went to school here, and I studied in the States. I'm a man. So all these things mean I'm drawn to certain subjects and also blind maybe or less good at other things. And so I like to present that kind of subjectivity. And then finally, you know, you brought up having witnessed so many traumatic events and difficult events. I think writing about myself and seeing myself as a character is in some way self-therapy. I'm able to process, I see myself as a character to whom all these things have happened, including the divorce, including, you know, being separated from my daughter and those kinds of events. And writing about myself in that way helps me process all the emotions and helps me move on and continue this kind of work.
Yeah. So I'll ask one last question and then we will open it up. We will have some 20 plus minutes for interaction with the audience. So you have close, inseparable ties with India. You just talked about India. And you have worked mostly for foreign editors. You have written for New York Times and several other foreign magazines, newspapers and TV. So when you look at journalism in India, you know, reporting, political reporting or frontline reporting, international coverage, what is your opinion? What is your takeaway? Because I'm asking because there would be a lot of journalists here, you know, students of media studies, so they would also like to know your perspective.
So I guess the first thing I would say is my job in Congo, my first job, it's still open. So if anybody wants to go there, the job is still open and you can read all about it in my first book and you can decide for yourself if you want to, you know, throw yourself into a career in journalism. It's still the case today that, you know, there's a huge war in Congo, there's all this news, and you can make a living, you can earn a living and, you know, reporting on this kind of stuff, but nobody has gone there. So I would say, you know, that opportunity is there. I guess, but to your question, I ask myself why Indian media outlets, and you're the foreign editor of The Hindu, so, but I ask myself, why Indian media outlets don't report on the world as much as I would like to see them. And in the East or the global South, there's a lot of complaining about Western reporting. But now countries like India, Nigeria, Kenya, China, there is the money. So why isn't there more foreign reporting? Why aren't countries like India sending more foreign correspondents out into the world to bring back an Indian perspective on global affairs? This is the question I find I'm asking myself, because I don't see many Indian reporters, and I think as India's economic power rises, the world is also hungry, and Indians also are more hungry for an Indian perspective, an Eastern, maybe a more nuanced perspective on global affairs than what you might find in Western papers. And to me, it's still kind of crazy that for a Nigerian to receive news on the Central African Republic, the news has to travel to London or New York and then come back to Nigeria.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite similar, there may be some exceptions in this region, but for news from Cambodia to reach an Indian reader, the news from Cambodia has to go to London and then come back to India. Why? India has so many historic ties with Cambodia, going back hundreds of years with the monsoons and trade and religion, and yet now we are reliant on a Western perspective or a Western filter to receive news about each other. And I think that needs to change.
Yeah. Thanks Anjan. So I'm sure that there would be interesting questions from the audience. They would also like to ask you many things. We have roughly 23 minutes. So I just wanted to add a couple of things. So he has written 3 books on Africa, but he has also spent his time in Cambodia, and then he is currently living in Mexico. So he has a lot of expertise on what's happening around the world. So in case you want to ask him questions, please.
Yeah, this is Jay Shaktivel. Excuse me, here. Yeah, I'm Jay Shaktivel from the University of Madras, Journalism Department. As a faculty of the Journalism Department, I want to know one important question. That means in the Central African Republic, not only the Central African Republic, all around the African countries, we came to know that the media access is radio. Is it true, or any other media where the people were accessed? What type of media the people were accessed there in that particular place? For example, I was with the DW World Radio. We request to target Tamil language broadcast to India like that. We asked them. They said that we only focused on the African countries because there only the proper media access were not there. So all the international broadcasters were target African countries only, particularly the radio medium. Could you please light upon that? No. The radio is a very important medium there in the African countries. Is it true?
Media access.
Radio
access.
He's
asking about the radio access
in the African countries.
African countries.
So yes, radio is the main form of media in these countries and main medium through which people receive information. But radio has a problem that it's very centralized. And also people speaking on radio can be recognized. So anonymity is hard. And if you want to destroy a radio station, it's very easy. You just destroy the antenna. So usually it's used for government broadcasts. And if there's a revolution or any kind of rebel movement or any independence movement, they tend to use print. Because print you can easily reproduce. It's anonymous. You don't know who's written it. It's hard to destroy. If somebody destroys, burns all the copies, if you get one copy, you can make photocopies and continue. So print media has a very powerful effect in, especially in independence movements, in independent journalism. And I think you continue to see that in the Arab Spring and other independence movements. Even social media posts, it's print, it's digital, but it's still print. So there are advantages of print that, that radio can't replicate, but what radio does, which print does less easily, is huge reach. So.
Hello. Thank you so much for that insightful discussion. So one question I wanted to ask is what you brought up, the idea of being neutral. As a journalist, it's important that we have to maintain our neutrality. But at the same time, the conflicts which you have witnessed or the conflicts we read about, we see and constantly hear about it's very difficult to maintain neutrality as well as not be swayed away by the situation that's unfolding. So how would you, as someone who has reported from Frontlines, would say that we need to like maintain that neutrality, and how would you kind of overlook our own views and present a more nuanced perspective of the situation?
Sure, that's a great question. I think, I partly touched upon it before, but I don't think we can be neutral. I don't think we can be objective. So my solution is to present to the reader who I am and say, this is my perspective. I'm coming in from this perspective. Obviously, everything that I'm writing is true. It's verified, but it's going to come with certain blind spots. It's going to come with certain biases, and I'm going to present them to you. And if you are interested, you can follow me. But I'm not pretending to present you with truth, because I think that would be false. And I think that's a problem with I find it to be a problem with many media productions nowadays. You find a journalist has made a TV show or documentary or news article about something, and you know nothing about the journalist. Why are they there? What got them interested? Who are they, forgetting? Or who have they not given a voice? All these questions you have no answers to. And for me, they're really important. Every time I watch a good documentary, I see a filmmaker or journalist who's obsessed, I ask myself, why did they get obsessed? What brought them here? And they don't tell you. And I think that's a problem. So I try to be as transparent as I can in stating my position. And that's I think as best as I can do, because I think it's almost impossible to completely interrogate every single reason for why I got interested, but I try to do as much as I can. And I think that's how journalism needs to move, to become more subjective, to not pretend to be objective. And I think that's going to be important in the future, especially now around the world, journalists are losing trust. And I think they're losing trust because of this gap. Because journalists don't say why they're there, people can assume all kinds of things and ascribe all kinds of ulterior motives. And I think the more transparent we are, the more trust we'll gain. And I think, in this age of disinformation, I think that's how we need to think about our profession.
I'm here, sir. Sir, to your left. Most of the Western political philosophy says that conflict and war happens because human nature is individual-centric, ego-centric, and that is the reason why conflict occurs. You have practical experience in conflict areas. What is your understanding of human nature? Is it not just self-interest? Does it involve a little bit of dynamism, multiple causes, or what is your understanding?
I think conflicts, there are conflicts everywhere. The reason they boil over, I think, in certain areas is because, at least in my view, the geopolitical forces and the institutions aren't able to contain the conflicts. But I don't think that certain people in certain areas are more prone to conflict than others. I think the dynamics that I see in every country, in Central Africa, for example, I see them here, I see them in the States, I see them in Mexico. My work isn't sort of trying so much to, understand why people end up in these kinds of conflicts. And I guess I wouldn't put myself in the position of trying to explain the human condition or the nature of conflict. But I do see the seeds of it everywhere, and I think in any country these kinds of conflicts can boil over and become full-scale wars. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to move from the outside to the inside into your mind. You've reported from very difficult situations, threatening ones. What kind of a person do you need to be able to do that, psychologically?
So I think I think you need to be a person with a strong sense of mission to be in these places, because there is no rational reason to put yourself in these places. It doesn't make sense. If somebody asks you to explain it, you can't really explain it in rational terms. It's much easier to, be in Mexico City, where I now am, and, go to parties and have a good time at dinners with friends. So you really need to have a strong sense of mission, a strong sense of why you're there. And I think for me, what does it is, every time I travel to these places, I find incredibly inspiring individuals and communities whom I don't find in the cities at dinners and at the parties. Incredible people. In Mexico recently, I was in a community that's fighting to protect their forest, and the community was protesting on the highway, and I was at the protest with them. And I asked somebody, what's going to happen next? What's the government going to do? And they said, well, they're going to kill somebody. And I said, who are they going to kill? They said, oh, that guy, David, David in Spanish. They're going to kill David because they already kidnapped him and they took him to prison and we got him out, but they're going to kill him. And so I spoke to David, and I went to his house, and we were sitting in his yard. His kids are running behind me, and I got a camera out and I asked him, aren't you afraid the government is going to kill you? And he said, of course I'm afraid, but I would rather people remember me for what I actually believe than remember me as someone afraid hiding in my house. And I remember sitting there with his kids running behind me, and I thought, this guy is just incredible. He's putting his life out there for his community, for his land, for his forest. And my instinct at that moment was, how can I help you? How can I serve you? And you're taking so much risk, and I want to take a little risk in comparison. So, for the average person in a city, maybe it seems like what I do is very risky. But actually, compared to the people who live in these places full time, I'm taking very little risk. I'm there for a few days. They live their whole lives there. And so I ask myself, how can I take a little risk to help you when you're taking so much risk for a good cause? And so that's really what drives my work. Every place I go to, I look for people like this. I always find them, and that inspires me to keep doing my work.
Hi, I'm Vikas. One short question, in your discussion, you informed about one way, some place people were kept hostage, and then when call came from US and that nothing should happen to one American. So I understand those countries who are economically superior and they have stronger political ties, their voices are heard stronger, but people in distress, if from India or somewhere less developed country or developing nation, if they are going and as you informed that Pope also informed, this is Africa, this happens this way only here. So your thoughts something like what need to be done so that the people in developing countries, if they are held hostage or into problem, the government should take some initiative. Any thoughts on that?
So, can you keep the mic closer and then speak up a bit? The question part.
Yeah, actually my thought here, query basically is when developing countries, somebody is held hostage.
When things happen to our citizens. So another story, when I was in Congo, before I traveled into this war zone, I went to the Indian embassy and I said, I want to register the embassy, and if something happens, can I call you? And he said, sir, all we do here is if you die, we'll get your body to India and your parents have to pay for it. So we are not here to help you, we can't help you. So it has to start from that place. And I wrote an article recently about how China and India, their presence in Africa. India has really old roots in Africa. Indian migrants have built African economies and are some of the most wealthy people in African economies now. China has no such history, but China is moving in aggressively, and India is sort of not really investing and building on that ancient relationship that it has with Africa, with Cambodia, with many countries. So until India sort of tries to build these connections and places importance on its own citizens, no one else is going to respect our lives. You know, the US government is very clear about the importance that they give to each of their citizens. Whereas, as I said, the Indian embassy was just like, here, we're here to register.
Hello, sir. My question to you is, you were in such a life-altering place like Congo, and most of the time you must have been so distressed, and it was do-or-die circumstances that you were in. Also, you mentioned that while you were writing the book, it was like self-therapy because you were able to process. So my question to you was, how did you strike a balance between covering such important stories and also maintaining your mental health? That is one question. The other question is that people in Congo, they've been undergoing this distress. The distress is quite persistent, and definitely when you have looked at them, you could have seen the resilience that they are showing, right? So what did the resilience of those local communities teach you?
So I think I'll answer the second question first. When I was living in Congo and I was trying to write stories, I was trying to sell stories. I realized that the stories that sell are very different from the stories that Congolese people and African people share among themselves. What they consider important were not the stories that the world considered important. And so I felt that the news that I was reporting, which is the first draft of history, they could say that journalists write the first draft of history. It's very different from the country that they are living in and they share amongst themselves. So this raised a lot of questions about the kind of news that sells, the kind of news that doesn't sell. I'll give you an example. So I was reporting on, in Congo, there was a huge protest by all these women in front of the UN office. And a lot of these women had been raped, and sometimes by UN officers. And nothing had happened, nothing had been done, no justice. And so I called my editor and I said, there's this huge protest, all these women are protesting, it's an important issue, it's the headline in Congo, we need to report on it. And he asked me, has anybody been killed? I said, no. He said, any shooting, any violence? I said, no. He said, not interesting. So that news doesn't get covered. So a lot of my first book, Stringer, is trying to survive by selling news, but also me trying to understand why some things make the news and why some things don't make the news. And I think, these stories that Congolese people share and locals share in their media networks, I think they play a great role in, even if justice doesn't happen, at least people know what has happened, and there's a collective sense of indignance, sort of indignation, that justice has not been served and we need to make things better. So I think that the media plays that kind of role. To your first question, I think striking a balance is hard, and I don't think my profession of journalism has really figured this out. Nobody taught me how to take care of myself while doing this kind of work. My editors just told me, get the story, and that's all that we care about. So I've had to learn about it along the way, and I think writing about my experience has helped me kind of understand the personal cost of doing this kind of work, which is not just my own story, which is many reporters, many frontline human rights defenders, human rights workers also live through similar stories, but we don't write about it because we're not trained to turn the camera on ourselves. We're always trained to look at other people. But I think it's now important I think it's an obligation, if we're reporting on other people, to report on ourselves at the same time. And I think it's only fair to report on our own vulnerabilities, our own fears, our own questions at the same time as we're reporting on what other people are going through.
Hello. So in your experience, what suggestions would you give to stop the violence in DRC from being there in person? The second question is that I met a African diplomat who says as you just remove all the outside interference, let Africans stew in our own blood and whatever, and then we will come out of it. That's his opinion in a meeting like this. That's the second question. Do you think he's right? The third question, this movie Blood Diamond, your story reminds me of Blood Diamond. How accurate it is as a work of fiction if you replace, say, some the diamond with lithium or something like that?
So I think I'll again start with the last question. I think, the movie is fairly realistic, but the problem with the movie is that there's always a white guy saving the day, right? So that's the Hollywood story, and real life doesn't happen like that. But I think the issues that the movie represents are quite realistic. There is foreign interference. The thing that struck me most when I was in Congo was that the foreign embassies, the Western embassies, they were there to protect their companies. And so, for example, there was one mining company from Australia financed by the World Bank called Anvil Mining. And Anvil had given their pickup trucks to the government, which used their trucks to massacre 100 protesters and put them in a mass grave. I wrote a story about this. It went all the way up to Paul Wolfowitz, who was then the head of the World Bank, and he buried the report. And the US Embassy also buried the report. The US and Australian embassies, they were there to protect their companies, not to protect the Congolese people. So I think, to answer your first and second questions, that's the problem. There's huge injustice, huge war crimes, and when somebody tries to, obtain justice for those crimes, the embassies are the problem. They block justice, they block the companies from being held accountable. And the same thing has happened in Nigeria with Shell and Ken Saro-Wiwa. He was killed. It's pervasive across the world. And this kind of coalition between the companies and the embassies means that there's a lot of power stacked against countries like Congo, who, even if they want to serve their people, they find they're up against huge geopolitical forces that maybe it's complicated for them to negotiate. And then there's corruption, of course. They're bought out. These companies and governments pay the politicians, so it gets complicated. I think there's a book out. We just had the death anniversary of Patrice Lumumba, who was Congo's independence hero. And I think it's worth mentioning that he wanted to unite Congo, and then I think it was Belgian paratroopers got in a USAID, so US government plane, took off from a British airbase, came to Congo, captured him, delivered him to his enemies, who then cut him up into pieces, killed him, and then threw his body in the jungle. And he was, for me, a figure like Gandhi was in India during independence. And if you think about what might have happened before independence, if somebody had done that to Gandhi, that's what happened to Congo. So that's what they're fighting against all the time. It's incredible foreign forces that don't want the country to unite. And when there is a leader that comes up, they get rid of him.
One last question.
Hi. Do you think it was entirely a sense of mission that led you to do your work in Central Africa?
Please keep the mic closer to you.
Sorry. Do you think it was entirely a sense of mission that led you to do your work in Central Africa? Or was there like a sense of adventurism or a yearning to do something exciting that, that made you take your decision to go there?
No, that's a great question. And I think, when I say sense of mission, that's after 15 years of reflecting, 18 years. I'm 40 years old now. When I went to Congo, I was 22. After 18 years of reflecting on why I keep doing this, I've come to this answer of a sense of mission. But certainly when I started out, I was 21 when I was planning my journey. I thought to myself, there was a sense of adventure, there was a sense of excitement, there was a sense of doing something that, I didn't have permission to do. When I was graduating from Yale, I had this job at Goldman Sachs as a mathematician. I had this possibility to make a lot of money. My parents who are here, they certainly would have preferred that, I think. And I think there was a sense in me of, being a rebel and breaking against that and going and doing something that seemed to me more exciting, more important. But at that time, the thoughts were very nascent, very ephemeral. There was just a little voice in my head saying, this might be interesting. And then I just kept, every time I had a choice, I kept continuing to do it. And then I was forced to ask myself why. And then I come to these bigger questions and, because the sacrifices also become larger. there's my family, there's a daughter, these questions, the risks become bigger, there are more people who depend on me, who, you know, whose lives, you know, whom I matter to. And so I can't take my own life so sort of nonchalantly. I can't just sort of be so callous about my own life. So I have to think about why I'm doing this work. And that's an answer I've come to over a long time. But yes, for sure, there's, and I think, you know, it's also a problem because a lot of journalists go out with a sense of adventure and they never get past that. And you see that in the books. A lot of the books and a lot of their lives are just about the adventure. And in Congo, I'll just end with this. In Congo, I met one such reporter, a photographer, who came for the elections. And I remember we were all camped out at the big 5-star hotel in Kinshasa, the capital of Congo. And I opened the cyber cafe door where all the journalists were filing their stories. And I looked at this guy, and on his face was death. And I thought, oh, I don't want to be like you. And when I ask myself why people end up like that, it's because I don't think they ever come to that sense of mission. They're always chasing the thrill. And I think that only keeps you going for so long and ultimately destroys you, because you can't sustain this kind of work over 20, 30, 40 years on just the thrill, on the adventure, on the adrenaline. It doesn't work. It'll eat you up.
Thank you very much, Anjan. So these books, the 3 books, these books offer first-person insights on what's happening in Africa. So if you want to understand the conflicts in Africa, if you want to have an advanced view of these conflicts, I think you should read these books. I'm sure that Anjan is working on more books on Cambodia, on Mexico. So as a reader, I'm also looking forward to those books, and all the very best. Thanks for joining us at the Hindu Lit Fest. Thank you very much, everybody.